Welcome to Cult Film School. Class is in session. We're your hosts, Adrian, that's me, and Dion.
That's me.
Good evening. That's my Hitchcock.
Don't quit your day job.
In this episode titled Bates, Norman Bates, we have decided to overstay our welcome in Fairvale and talk more Psycho.
Hitchcock exploitation. I'm going to make it a thing, damn it.
That is a thing.
Well, no, it's a thing now. Oh, I hope it's a thing now.
In our last episode, Robin Wood and the American Nightmare, we discussed the Alfred Hitchcock classic from 1960, and we thought, much like Universal Studios, why stop there? So 22 years later, in 1983, Universal did the unthinkable. They made a second Psycho, aptly named Psycho 2. Then 3 years later, in 1986, emphasis on 3, we got the aptly named Psycho 3. Then 4 years later, in 1990, we of course got the aptly named Psycho 4, the beginning. They had to mess with it. They were on a roll and they just had to. So yeah, Hitchcock's Psycho has 3 sequels. These sequels are not a trilogy per se, in that they pick and choose what they consider canon and not canon. But what all 3 do have in common is they all follow the original 1960 film and they all star Norman Bates himself. Of course, we're talking about Vince Vaughn. No, we mean Anthony or Tony Perkins. And for the record, right off the bat, our discussion today will not be covering the Gus Van Sant Psycho remake with Vince Vaughn, who plays Norman Bates in that one. Nor will our discussion include Bates Motel, both the TV series that ran from 2013 to 17, and also the same name of the 1987 TV movie, which originally was a pilot for a never-made series starring Bud Cort and Lori Petty. Yeah, that happened. But before we check in at the Bates Motel, possibly for good,
I hope so.
don't forget to follow us. We are on all the popular social media platforms, all at Cult Film School.
We're probably on some of the less popular social media platforms as well.
We are also on Letterboxd, where you can read our written reviews that embody our podcast discussions. Or if you want to reach us more intimately, we are ready and willing.
Yeah.
By email, cultfilmschoolpodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so Dion, the Psycho sequels.
Yes.
Did you see these before, like when they came out in the 80s, or?
Well, I was around in the 80s, unlike some of us. What's funny is I don't have a clear memory of seeing these films, but there are scenes from Psycho 2 burned into my adolescent brain. Like, I know when I was young, in maybe my young teens, I know I saw Psycho 2 on, home video, rented from the video store, because we're not getting into spoiler territory yet, but there's a scene in Psycho 2 burned into my brain. I've remembered it for now, I don't know, like over 30 years, burned into my brain. I don't recall Psycho 3, but that's not to say I didn't see it. But I know I'd never seen Psycho 4 before, because if I had seen Psycho 4 before, I might have asked you, do we really need to talk about it in this episode? But yeah, so the short version of me and the Psycho sequels is Psycho 2 scarred me for life. What about you?
I think I was introduced to the Psycho sequels from my friend Scott, who I became friends with from working at the video store together. Speaking of video store, yeah, I remember him coming in on one of my training days, and because I was the last one from our friend group to get hired, and he had mentioned he was going as Buffalo Bill for Halloween, and I thought, he's good people. Anyway, so he introduced me to a lot of weird shit over the years. So I'm pretty sure he introduced us, like, one night after work. We all went to someone's house and watched Psycho 2, and I'm pretty sure Psycho 3. I don't know if he introduced us to Psycho 4 or if I just sought that out afterward. Yeah, I think that's where I first was introduced to them. I was in my 20s when I saw these.
Yeah, I might have been 10 or 11 when I saw Psycho 2, which is why it was burned into my consciousness, I think. But that's the thing, is that, like, not the entire film, just like one set piece. Like, I remember it as clear as day, which is saying something because my memory is awful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we all have that horror film that we watched way too young that is seared into our brains, and then we watched it as adults and we're like, it's not that bad.
That was my experience watching Psycho 2 again this week. It's like, "Oh, yeah, I remember this. This is I can sleep with the lights off. I'm okay."
So with that, let's get into the Psycho sequels. Bates, Norman Bates.
Here at Cult Film School, we only have one rule, and that is to do your homework before coming to class. Please watch these films in advance, even the made for TV films. Otherwise, beware of spoilers.
Hey, back in the day, made for TV stuff was an event.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm saying this one. We'll get there. I don't want to bury the
We'll
lead.
get there. We'll get there. So, okay. So before we begin, just so our listeners are clear, we're going to talk Psycho by Psycho, and then we'll get into all three Psychos together. Again, these films are not a trilogy in the same way, say, the David Gordon Green Halloween movies are a trilogy,
That's a trilogy.
but these are three movies, three Psycho movies, and whatever. We're going to do our normal thing. We're going to talk about all of them at the end, okay?
Great. Okay, done. Let's lock that in.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Some of us more than once.
So, Psycho 2, if you go on IMDb, it will say, after 22 years of psychiatric care, Norman Bates attempts to return to a life of solitude, but the specters of his crimes and his mother continue to haunt him.
That's okay as kind of a general plot summary. Doesn't give you anything from any hard details of the plot. I know sometimes in episodes past, we will skewer these reviews, these summaries for synopsis, whatever they're called, for like giving away too much. This gives away nothing. So to that end, it's not offensive, but it's also so generic that could apply to 2, 3, or 4.
What does specters mean?
Ghosts,
Oh,
images, visions, something haunting him.
there you go. I just learned a new word.
I can't believe you didn't know specters from all your Ghostbusters fanfic or whatever you do. Before we actually get to Psycho, it's worth noting how we get to Psycho 2. What's noteworthy? I'll keep this quick. Sir Alfred Hitchcock dies in 1980, and in the wake of his death, things are happening with regard to his estate. When he worked in the 50s for Paramount, his deal was so sweet. Paramount didn't own the films. He owned them outright, a number of them. And so he effectively, one, took them to his grave, and two, after their original theatrical release, like they were not seen, they were not rescreened. These films have become known as the Hitchcock Five. And in the early 80s, Universal renegotiated with Hitchcock's estate to get the rights to these films, to own them, like they owned a number of Hitchcock's other work that he made directly through Universal. And so these films include Rope, Rear Window, The Trouble with Harry, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and Vertigo. So these films, the Hitchcock Five, end up being theatrically re-released. It was a kind of a spectacle in itself when these things came out in 83, because some of these films had not been theatrically released or screened or available for maybe 20 or 30 years. The reason this is important, I think, contextually or historically, is like, on the one hand, you've got filmmakers like Brian De Palma, who in the 1970s kind of made a career homaging all these Hitchcock films. And it's noteworthy that he's doing those homages while these films are basically in moratorium. But then the other thing that's happening is in the early 80s, after Hitchcock's death, there is studio interest, specifically from Universal, in Hitchcock's estate and these kind of now new again films for a new generation. And it's in that context that there's now increased attention on a new Psycho film.
Right. So this is all happening in the early 80s.
Yeah.
So around the same time, Robert Bloch, who wrote the original novel Psycho, puts out his Psycho 2 book in 1982. The plot of that revolves around Norman Bates escaping the mental institution and traveling to Hollywood to stop the production of a film based on his life, kind of doing what the Scream movies would do with like the fictional Stab movie series within them, kind of like that.
Hmm.
So this kind of prompted Universal Studios to make their own Psycho 2, in part because they were upset with Bloch's book and it's kind of poking at the horror film industry. So they start development on a Psycho 2 movie of their own. They pick up Hilton A. Green to produce the film. He was the AD on the original Psycho. He goes to Hitchcock's daughter to kind of get her blessing. And apparently, she said the idea was great and it was something her father would have loved. So, with that, they look at directors, and you mentioned Brian De Palma making all these Hitchcockian pastiches. Big word. Big word. I looked that one up,
It's a good one.
but he turned it down. So they then go to Richard Franklin. He was an Australian director who had just put out Road Games, which is kind of, it's basically Rear Window on a truck.
Who was, like a protege and like a avid Hitchcock fan.
Yeah, he apparently had an encyclopedia-like knowledge of Hitchcock's filmography. So he jumps at the chance to direct. He has the same agent as Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but a different Tom Holland, who had started off as an actor, but basically made a name for himself as a writer, wrote the creature feature, The Beast Within, and the Canucksploitation film, which is Canadian exploitation film. And one of my personal favorites, Class of 1984. He wrote that. Tom Holland would go on to write and direct Fright Night, another Rear Window inspired film, and the original Child's Play. He comes on board to write. And then they get Dean Cundey to shoot the film, who had worked with John Carpenter a lot and was also a big fan of Hitchcock. Jerry Goldsmith they get to compose the score. Anyway, so they assemble this production team basically of players that are fans of Hitchcock. But the big question is, would Anthony Perkins return to play Norman Bates? They just went ahead as if that was not happening, and this first started development as a TV movie, and there was a rumor that Christopher Walken was going to play Norman Bates, but Perkins eventually agreed to participate when he read Holland's script, and this shifts the production to basically become a theatrical release. It gets a decent but modest budget of 5 million, and they assemble a cast of some kind of notable people. Like Robert Loggia is in this movie, who apparently was one of the actors up for the original Sam Loomis.
Oh, that's a small world.
Yeah, Robert Loggia and Dennis Franz.
Sweaty, greasy Dennis Franz, which is there any other kind? Not in these films.
Yeah, and Vera Miles returns.
Yes, Lila Loomis.
Right. So in the interim, her and Sam Loomis got married.
That's the implication, yes. And they had a daughter.
Mary Loomis. Mary, of course, being the original character's name from the Psycho book, but they changed to Marion for the film.
And in the film, she gives her fake name to Norman Bates as Murray Samuels, which is the name that Marion Crane used as an alias when she checked in at the Bates Motel.
Well, speaking of Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, there was talks of her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, coming on board to play Mary.
Co-lead of Franklin's Road Games from like the year before.
That's right.
2 on the nose.
Yeah, Franklin thought it'd be like too distracting. Also, she was trying to get out of horror films because she was kind of a scream queen at this point, and she had just starred in the biggest comedy of the year, Trading Places.
Yeah.
So that just wasn't happening. But Meg Tilly, they get, and I really like her in this film. So when we mentioned Sam Loomis, he was written out of the script, but he was originally set to appear. But John Gavin was apparently serving as the American ambassador to Mexico at this time.
So he had a better paying gig, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Anyways, that's kind of how this film kind of shapes up to be what it became. I don't know where you want to take this, Dion, but I personally love this film.
I don't know if I love it, but I think it's a really goddamn special film. I want to take it to start by saying like this is a sequel done very like this is a good sequel. This is done with care. So many like nods to the 1960 film. Uh but it really, I think, treads a fine line in a good way about like taking these nods to the old that if you're an astute viewer, you kind of immediately recognize, and putting them in this new context so that it works in the new film, even if you don't have those old nods. It's like, okay, yeah, the character does this or the shot is that. Yeah. So for me, I think the best, like the greatest strength of this film is probably in its script. So like what Holland does is really layered and nuanced in a surprising way for a Psycho sequel. That's where I want to start.
This film has no right being as good as it is,
Yes.
being a sequel to such a beloved film
Yes.
essentially 2 decades later. It's a surprisingly good film. We were talking about this before, and you mentioned, like, it feels like a love letter to Hitchcock.
Yeah.
That's kinda what I want to mention all the players involved, because I think that was very intentional that this was made as a love letter to Hitchcock's work. Hitchcock makes a cameo in this film.
It's funny because I didn't notice it when I watched it, but I've heard about it. Where does it occur?
We go into Mother's room for the first time with Mary and Norman. The room is dark, and just before they turn the lights on, we see the shadow of the profile of Alfred Hitchcock in the corner.
Yes.
They homage that because Hitchcock famously made a cameo in all his films. They also homage shots from the original film.
Yes.
Like, we see the point of view shot from the stairwell underneath the shower head with the water coming out. Toomey's death is like Arbogast's,
Yes.
an entire scene where someone's giving the exposition of everything that happened at the end, like with the sheriff in this one.
The one that jumped out to me when he brings Mary, the Meg Tilly character, back to the motel and goes to give her a room, and he goes for cabin one, and then he changes it. Like,
Oh yeah, yeah.
so of course he famously gives Marion Crane from 1960 cabin one, and that's how he peeps on her. But then there's that whole kind of peeping on someone in the bathroom. Those shots are kind of played in some ways. They're repeating the shots from 60, but in other ways, we're not seeing who is looking at her, right?
Well, I was gonna say, is he peeping on her? Because that's the thing with this film. It's like it's a murder mystery. So there are deaths happening, but we don't know who is committing them.
The thing, like one of the reasons Psycho became as seminal, as influential as it is because it acts, as we talked about in the last episode, it acts as kind of like it's this seminal horror film. It's like a proto slasher. It kind of goes from the old say, haunted house movie into like a new kind of horror. And part of what I think is a common criticism of the 1960 film is that it is a kind of a slasher film with people getting murdered by knife, but it's also a murder mystery. However, because it is Psycho, the mystery is like non-existent. Everyone knows who the murderer is. Everyone knows the backstory, unless you live under a rock and this is the first time you've ever heard of a thing called a movie. But what's interesting is that those two things, murder mystery and slasher film, I mean, yes, we see them in the 70s with Giallos, but here, this Psycho 2 emphasizes the murder mystery. This becomes really clear when we see Psycho 3, but it emphasizes the murder mystery in Psycho 2. And it's so effective because like if you've only seen Psycho, and so well, Norman Bates was a murderer and he thought he was his mother and he murdered people with his own hands because he was compelled to do so for these psychological reasons. Great. But it's still Norman Bates. This film makes it very clear it it can't be Norman Bates.
Well, that's the whole thing about that's what I really like about it, is like you really don't know who's committing these crimes.
Everyone is a red herring.
Yeah.
Everyone is a potential suspect. Everyone is a potential murderer. Everyone has like sometimes explicitly say like double intentions or are two-faced, and some of the characters we can almost like we assume they have another agenda. Like what's going on with his doctor? What's going Does anyone trust Robert Loggia ever? Like
Yeah, you really don't know who's behind it all until the very end.
and even to that, things happen throughout the narrative where you're like, okay, so who is the killer? And at a certain point you're like, Is there more than one?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Cause like midway through, there is a reveal. Mary, when we meet her, we don't know that she is the daughter of Lila Loomis.
Lila Loomis, so Marion's sister, and her daughter are trying to interfere with Norman upon his release because Lila is adamant that Norman shouldn't be released. He's crazy. He should be, he murdered people. He should be committed for life. And so they have this plan to kind of drive him to commit murder, to drive him back to the insane asylum.
Right. Essentially, Mary befriends Norman, but we don't know that she has any connection to Lila until about midway through, and that there is a plan that the two of them have hatched that they're going to try and drive him insane again to get him recommitted. Uh, so that's revealed halfway through, but even then, not all the questions are answered because we still don't know who's committing the murders or who's talking to Norman on the phone as mother, and it could be more than one person.
Yes, and the other thing that when you're talking about the relationship between Mary and her mother Lila, as Mary befriends Norman, you also get this beautiful redux remake of the same paralleling in 1960, where in 1960 it was about how Marion Crane was really a mirror image to Norman Bates. And even though one was normal and one was quote unquote crazy, they were kind of two sides of the same coin. Here, at a certain point, it's very clear that Mary is kind of being tormented by her mother's Lila's maniacal like one track mind to like do in Norman Bates. And you get this idea that both Norman and Mary both have these like domineering mothers that are like interfering with their lives. And
Yeah.
so like in other words, it does the same parlor scene from 1960, but it does it in a new way and puts it in a new context. This is what I meant by like it's kind of a like a legacy sequel to 60, but it's in this like it's not representing 60, but it's remaking it in this new image. And like it evokes all the stuff that we're familiar with, but it presents it in like a new way, which is commanding. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, see that because that's the thing. So, like, we know that Mary's kind of in on it with her mother, but at the same time, throughout the course of her relationship with Norman, they are bonding. They both have domineering mothers, and Lila's kind of handsy with her daughter. So, like, there is undertones of abuse there that again is like Norman and his mother. And just through the nature of her bonding with Norman, we get the sense that like it can't be Norman. You just in the performance and in their bond, like you just feel that it's not him. There's like that scene. It's such a beautiful scene where she's kind of like cradling him almost like a mother would a child, and where she's just like, think of the good memories. And he's like, I can't, the doctors took them all away. Like it's a scene that you would see like an Oscar drama or something. Like it's got some really beautiful moments that you really empathize with Norman to the point that you just, even though you know his whole backstory and he's a mother killer or whatever, you just feel that he cannot possibly be the one behind all this.
There is a set piece in the film where teenagers break into the basement, and this was the scene that scarred me for life. Teenagers break into the basement to, like smoke weed and have sex, do those teenager things. And then someone, hears them and comes to explore. And then the girl gets away out of like the cellar window, but the boy trips on the firewood and gets brutally stabbed to death, in Psycho 2's version of the shower scene from 1960. And at this moment, Mary has locked Norman in the attic. She says this. She's and so like
Well, we see it.
yeah.
We see him in from the window of the attic where he's trapped, and it pans down all the way down to the basement. So we see that he's trapped.
And at this point in the story, this is where like the mind games of it, both for characters to other characters, but also for us, the viewer. Norman starts saying that he's hearing the voice of his mother. And to the questions of who could have done these murders, his answer is always, well, it must have been my mother, my real mother. And we are immediately thinking it was his mother in 1960, so that's what he means, right? Like so in other words, it's him again. It's him again. It's him again. We don't know how, but it's him again.
Yeah, he's hearing his mother, but it's not that he's hearing her voice, like, she's calling him on the phone, and he's talking to her, and he's talking to different people, and as the movie goes on, we know that something is not we still don't believe it's Norman, but he is cracking because he'll be talking to his doctor on the phone, but then he'll answer as if he is the mother.
But only he does that performative stuff when he has an audience that is married. In other words, like Norman knows these people are trying to play him. And so it's not clear if he actually hears a voice or if he's just pretending to like marry, which again is how the film ultimately ends, right? Like everything he does effectively sets her up, right?
You have to like determine where you think that he's conscious of that and when he has snapped again. Because I think by the time we get to the phone call with the Dr. Raymond, I think he's snapped a little bit by that point.
I see. I don't think he snaps at all.
Oh, what are you talking about? Of course he does.
No, he feels like he's fully in charge of his faculties. He's not really hearing someone's voice. He's playing this act for the person who is attempting to drive him to insanity. So, what is he doing? He's showing them that he is insane, but he's not really insane. This is all very, very premeditated. No. He never loses his faculties.
Okay, so you think at the end when Mary has like dressed up as his mother to essentially get a hold of him because he is only responding to whoever is mother, you think he's being performative in that moment?
He knows he can control her if he forces her to dress like that and act like that because he knows she thinks that's what will control him.
Okay, I don't know if I ever read it like that. I feel like he's fine until like he isn't, and I feel like by that point he has snapped and needs someone to fill the role of mother, but then Meg Tilly gets shot, so then he needs to get another mother.
I would argue that he, yes, has these compulsions and yes, has these desires to kill, but he is being performative insofar as hearing a voice that is not on the phone and that it's his mother. He's doing this only for this audience. You know, he's never doing it alone. There's never a shot of him alone where this happens. And the ending of the film, when he acts the way he does, he is not being driven by some other force. In other words, he's not murdering when he does murder at the very end of the film. He doesn't have to embody another character to do it.
Wait, are you talking about Mrs. Spool?
Yeah, so we got to get to the end and talk about Spool. So basically what I'm saying is that if your argument is that his psyche snaps and he reverts into he's subsumed by the mother figure that causes him to murder. That is not the case in the film's final scene when his real birth mother appears and tells him, your mother who you thought was your mother is my sister, but she's not really your mother. I'm your mother.
Yes.
And oh, by the way, I've been killing all these people.
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Yeah. That's what I love. Yeah, it was this like little old woman who's been killing all these people this whole time. Okay, well, I see what you're saying, but I'm just saying I've never read the film like that. I read it that the thing I love about this movie is like if no one fucked with Norman, he'd probably be fine. But like,
Yeah.
but I feel like he's by the time we get to the final confrontation with Mary dressed up as mother,
Yes.
at that point the way I read it is like at that point he has snapped, so he needs that mother. She gets shot by the police, so she's gone. Then when Mrs. Spool comes to him and says, you know, I'm your real mother, whatever, he needs mother. So that's why he kills her because because he immediately takes her upstairs to the bedroom.
Yes. So two related things. One, the way he interacts with Mary Meg Tilly, slashing at him, attacking him. When I'm seeing this, I'm like, yeah, he's kind of boxing her in. He's not attacking her. He's getting all this damage. He's pretending like he's a victim here. And he's setting it up so that the police, who he knows are coming, will see her dressed as the murderous mother from 1960, dominating and going to attack him. And so, in other words, my reading of this is like he is the evil mastermind. My pushback against the reading that he is snapped is he ends up murdering what he's told is his birth mother, not dressed as his mother, not under any compulsion. It's very calm. Like he poisons her in the exact same way we are told in 1960 he murdered his mother and her lover.
Wait, does he poison her? See, this is the thing. Like
He
he's got the shovel waiting. So like he knows that mother is coming. Like his the woman who's been on the phone saying that she's his real mother this whole time. That's who he's referring to because he actually is talking to someone who's saying that she's his real mother.
at times, yes.
She comes to the house and he's got the shovel ready because he doesn't poison her. He puts his hand up, much like the key for room one, with the tea as if he's going to poison her with the tea like he does his other mother. But instead, he decides to just whack her in the head with a shovel. But he's whoever comes to that door, he knows is the person that's been saying is his real mother. And he has every intention at that point to kill that person because he needs a mother.
Yeah.
Well, why else would he have the shovel? Like, he's got it right in the kitchen. Why do you need a shovel in your kitchen?
I don't know what he's doing. Um, but like this is in my opinion, like this is the beauty of this film, right? Is that much like it is a mystery who the murderer is, and we do not know this until literally the final scene when it is explicitly revealed. Even by that revealing, I don't think we're fully convinced of it because there are alternate suspects and alternate motivations. And I guess connected to this is this idea that part of the beauty of the film is what is the motivation of Norman himself as a character. He is presented as like a victim and as like tortured and tormented, and there are moments of like what you'd call empathy
Oh, yeah, yeah.
between Mary and Norman, between the doctor, his doctor, and Norman. And so the film aligns you with this character, but at the same time doesn't align you so close that you, for instance, hear the voice of mother when he imagines hearing it. We're not 100% aligned with identifying with him, and that distance creates this ambiguity. And that ambiguity, that's the beautiful part of the film, right? Has he, as you've said, snapped, or is he in charge of his faculties and just murdering? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah, I think so too, and I agree with the what's that word?
Ambiguity.
I think that's, like, the best part of this film and what makes it such an amazing murder mystery, but, like, because we're so empathetic with Norman, I've never read this mastermind thing that he's doing where he so
Yeah. I mean, but that's the beautiful part to me is that like he is human and he is cold.
Oh, I totally can see your reading, I'm just saying in all the times I've watched this film, I've never read it like that.
Maybe that's because I am human and I'm cold. The only other thing I wanted to throw in, maybe as a way to kind of segue out of Psycho 2, is in addition to all this murder mystery stuff that we've been talking about, the psycho nods, the Hitchcock love, the nuance or character ambiguity, you also have for a psycho film, let's say, some pretty horrific murder scenes. There is a lot of on-screen violence, which is only noteworthy because it is a stark departure from 1960. And I mean, granted, that's like 20 odd years, but still.
Yeah, but I mean, this is what 1982. We're in the height of the slasher genre thing going on in the 80s, so I feel like that's just part of like the time this movie's been made in.
The like Psycho, the violence is explosive. So like we're not getting drawn out sadism. We're not even getting a lot of suspense set pieces with violence. The violence kind of just explodes, whether it's Dennis Franz getting his face cut open or whether it's my favorite, Vera Miles getting impaled right in the mouth.
I love how they turned that character into like a villain in this movie.
Yeah.
She's great. I love her in this film.
Again, like you can understand the position. She is committed. She has a worldview. She's like standing up for something she feels is important. And on the other hand, she's like awful, like completely awful. Like, no, go away, die.
I just want to note, I don't know if you came across this, but I thought it was interesting and a tribute to the performances in this film is Meg Tilly and Anthony Perkins apparently did not like each other, and it got to the point where Anthony Perkins tried to get her out of the film.
I'd read this. Yeah.
Yeah, their performances together is like they have great scenes in this film, so it's just interesting that that was the what was going on behind the scenes.
I don't know if I would go so far as to say Meg Tilly is great in the role.
Oh, I would.
Part of me feels like she's a little too introverted, withdrawn, soft, a little too soft, especially if we're meant to believe her motivation initially is this kind of investigative manipulation and blackmail and torture.
No, I don't see it like that. She's like Norman. She's soft like Norman, and I feel like she's put into this circumstance because of her mother.
Okay, hey, no, I can buy that. Yeah, like that rings true. Factoid, note, this is also, we have an early screen appearance from director Osgood Perkins in Psycho 2.
That's right. He's the vision of young Norman in the is it the door or
Reflection in the doorknob, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So, I know we recently talked about Longlegs, the Osgood Perkins film. This is I don't know if it's his first film, but, yeah, Osgood Perkins, Psycho 2, Small World.
Well, this and doesn't hurt that your dad's Norman Bates.
No, probably not.
Any last thoughts on Psycho 2?
As you said earlier, like, this film has no, like, it shouldn't be as good as it is. Has no right to be as good as it is. And I think the film's true strength is creating a murder mystery that is actually engaging, where we don't know who the killer is. At the same time, the character of Norman Bates is so humanized in this film. Norman Bates is presented as a true, unfettered victim. The fact that both of those things happen does something really, like, even though Psycho, it's 1960, is doing that, right? We talked about the humanizing of the Norman Bates character in that film. But the fact that it can sustain it here and add something new and do all these callbacks, like, that's remarkable. It's as if it's a remake, in some ways, a remake or a reboot of 1960, but it's also this new thing. And this new thing leaves us on edge in a way that only an original 1960s audience would have been seeing Psycho for the first time.
So the tagline for Psycho 2, it's 22 years later and Norman Bates is coming home.
I like it.
You can't argue with it.
No,
So
no, it is actually accurate, yes.
so Psycho 2 was a surprise hit at the box office. So it had a $5 million budget like we said and it made 34 million.
I'm sure I read somewhere that, like, Psycho 2, its box office did almost as well as Psycho did in its first run. I mean, it kind of speaks to what you've said, like the appetite for the early 80s American slasher film, cross-referenced with the cultural appeal of the Psycho film and the Norman Bates character and all that stuff. So, yeah, like, it doesn't hurt that it's a great film either, right? So,
Yeah, Quentin Tarantino will agree with you. He actually thinks this one's better than Psycho.
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, me neither. But I love it. So, Psycho 2 doing so well, there inevitably was a Psycho 3. So with that, uh, let's get into Psycho 3.
Oh god, okay, let's do it, please.
We lose a Dennis Franz, but we gain a Jeff Fahey. So if you go on IMDb, Dion, it will read Norman Bates falls in love with a fallen nun who stays at the Bates Motel alongside a drifter and a curious reporter. Meanwhile, Mother is still watching.
Yeah, but yeah, that's all true. So it feels like it's factually accurate, I think.
It makes it seem like the nun, the drifter, and the reporter are staying at the motel.
Well, I mean, even if they're not, they're spending a lot of time there. So sometimes I'll mention something like this when we look at these IMDb things, but, like, it doesn't really give you a sense of the flavor of the film. This is a very different film from Psycho 2. Personally, I think for the worse. You don't get that sense of tone or just, like, the the gaudy excessiveness of Psycho 3 in that summary.
This summary needed the word sleazy. This movie's so sleazy.
It could have used it twice.
I love it. So this is the directorial debut of Anthony Perkins. He gets to direct this one.
His first film, but he only made one other film?
Yeah, he directed a black comedy in '88 called Lucky Stiff.
Yeah. So, needless to say, Psycho 3 didn't kickstart his new career as a director, let's put it that way.
It didn't, but I mean, I love Psycho 2. I kind of love Psycho 3, but I love the visual style of Psycho 3.
It has a style.
Oh, it does. I love it.
Honestly, like, there are scenes, really more like rooms. They have like like a red filters or green filters and, neon.
Yeah.
It really in some ways feels like, oh yeah, this is like Blood Simple by by Michael Mann.
Apparently, he originally proposed that the film be in black and white, but then Universal rejected it. But then his main inspiration visually was, like you mentioned, Blood Simple, and he took the entire cast and crew to see a screening of that before shooting began, and that's where he kind of drew his visual style from.
Yeah.
But when I watch this film, I'm constantly reminded of the visual stylings of Italian Giallo. Like all you mentioned, all the colors,
Yes.
the neons, like Jeff Fahey's room for some reason is purple. And just even the kill scenes are very Giallo-esque. The knife, the shot of it where it looks like it's like a light under a door, but then it's just the blade of a knife reflecting, and just how like the kill scenes, like in the when he kills the girl in the telephone booth, there's like a beauty to it. The knife and the blood and glass and the lighting of it. It's almost like the gore is like dancing. It's very reminiscent of Italian Giallo to me.
I totally see that. And I think what I'm about to say maybe kind of like doubles down or extends that. So when I was talking about Psycho 2, I said Psycho is a murder mystery and it's this kind of like proto slasher thing, right? And Psycho 2 leans into the murder mystery part of it. And Psycho 3 leans into the slasher part of it.
Oh yeah.
But even though I would agree with you that it has a certain kind of visual excess in terms of it's not like surrealist, but maybe it's close to expressionistic in terms of this external world that is presented through framing, through color and through light in this kind of like exaggerated way for aesthetic effect. The one difference is, and again, what I'm about to say like doesn't apply to all Giallo because not all Giallo are like murder mysteries. But yeah, like this Psycho 3 is definitely in that school, in that vein of Giallo slasher film. But if Psycho had any pretense of being a murder mystery, that's totally gone out the window with this thing. When I think Psycho, I don't just think of the murder. I think the shots of Lila Crane walking up the staircase to the house. And it's like anticipation about what's to come, what's around that corner. It's like mystery and it's anticipation and suspense. I don't get any of that in Psycho 3.
No, I don't think he's trying to do that. I think the only Hitchcock homage is at the beginning. For some reason, we're homaging Vertigo. But after that, I don't think it's doing anything Hitchcockian.
To your point, yeah. If we could single out how many loving touches Psycho 2 has to Hitchcock's work in the 1960 film, that isn't really emphasized here. Instead, what's emphasized is like, remember that film from 1960 that I was in called Psycho? Here it is again, kind of, if you squint. Like, yes, it's an homage, but it feels like it's not what it's interested in. It's not kind of like lovingly done. It's just like, remember that thing? Here it is. Remember that other thing? Here it is.
Yeah, I feel like that's this whole movie. It's all kinds of shit, and I love it. This is like the junk food movie of Psycho. Like it's got everything. I love it.
Okay, when you put it like that, yeah. Oh yeah, it does do that. It is Psycho Sugar High. Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I love how the movie starts. It's just a black screen with a woman screaming, "There is no God," and then we find out it's a nun. I'm like, this is great. And we go from like Vertigo to like Paris, Texas, or something with like Jeff Fahey in the desert or whatever picking her up. I love Jeff Fahey in this movie.
I was gonna say if you were missing your greasy dirtbag from Psycho 2, just like hold my beer. Here's just Jeff Fahey.
Yeah, but like Dennis Franz, he's so likable. Like he's such a scumbag, but you still like him.
I don't know if you're meant to. I mean, he is charismatic, but I don't know if you're meant to like him. I didn't like him. I could register him as being charismatic.
I liked him. I don't
No, hey,
like
hey, you do you. I'm just saying that like I don't know if that's the way he's meant because like yeah, he's a bad boy. Yeah, he's like kind of like two-faced. He's a womanizer. He's a blackmailer. Yeah. I mean, like he's not a good character in any kind of moral sense.
Yeah, yeah, I liked him. I don't like I've seen this movie a dozen times. I still don't understand what he's doing in the room with
The fucking sex
the
scene.
sex scene, but
Oh my
I mean, I
lord.
guess the sex scene, we see this woman, kind of the naked woman who gets killed in the telephone booth later, like doing some sort of like, I guess, sexy dance while he's pointing purple lamps from his crotch towards her while like a Woody Woodpecker cartoon is playing. Like it's so fucking bonkers, but I kind of love it.
You had mentioned like this. You mentioned Buffalo Bill. Like this feels like yeah, this is like serial killer kind of stuff. I could imagine this in a different film.
You know what's funny you mentioned that? I was gonna mention this later. The original script for this film, that character, he was the killer behind the murders in this film. So he comes to the Bates Motel because he's obsessed with Norman Bates, and he's the one dressing up his mother.
That would have added a layer to the film it currently doesn't have. I don't know if that would have been a good layer, but it would have added something. Yeah,
Yeah, Universal rejected it because they're like, no, Norman's got to be the one killing, which is interesting because
yeah.
Psycho 2, he's not doing that.
Or is he? Huh?
Yeah, and Maureen was supposed to be a psychologist. She's supposed to like Robert Loggia's replacement.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't. The only thing that really kind of touched me is like resonant about her character is when Psycho 3 attempts to do its version of the shower scene murder. She goes to, have go to the bathroom to kind of clean herself, and then mother. So as we very clearly, it's Norman Bates dressed up as his mother with a knife coming to murder her in the shower scene, just like Marion Crane in 1960. And he opens up the curtains, and rather than the woman having a shower, she is in a bathtub up to her neck, full of blood because she has attempted to commit suicide. And then, so her kind of like delirious vision is not of Norman Bates as mother with a knife. It is as a religious icon with a religious object like the Virgin Mary with a crucifix. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's actually kind of cool because it's like, it like takes this scene we all know and are expecting, gives it to us to a point, inverts it, but then what it replaces it with is like a character beat in this kind of transitional or pivotal moment in this character's arc. It's like, okay, cool. That's actually neat because you don't get a lot of that in Psycho 3. It's a lot of like screaming and slashing and just like murders and different kinds of lights. It's a lot of Psycho 3.
It's a bit of a stretch that she envisions mother as the Virgin Mary, the dagger as a crucifix in her hand, right? I guess I'll chalk that up to like the amount of blood she's lost,
Yeah,
but like like what doesn't work for me in this film because a lot does. But Maureen the character, I just don't get her.
agreed, agreed. I don't think it works. No.
Yeah. I guess this movie is trying to explore what if Norman Bates had a girlfriend, right? Like,
What if it was Julie Andrews from The Sound of Music?
so like they have like a dinner date, I guess, at some like supper club for like people over 80, which I it's kind of in keeping with Norman, right? Of course he doesn't know what to do with a woman, right?
Or does he?
Yeah.
Sorry, anyway, keep going, keep going. They're at a supper club.
Supper club where he's like with a suicidal nun, and then they're gonna go to the motel and I don't know, make love, I guess, or something. But anyways, so following that scene, she leaves Norman to go be a nun again, and then immediately the next scene we see her in, she's telling the priest that she needs to go back to Norman because he understands her and she needs to go save him. She's just all over the place.
This is the thing for me is that Psycho 3, yes, it is histrionic. It's like hysterical at times. It's all like over the top. Even Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates is like breathy in his delivery. Even his performance feels exacerbated and exaggerated in a way that he is not in 1960 and he is not in 1983. He's kind of like measured and demure. I said to you with Psycho 2 that like it's because he's this like wicked mastermind murderer guy. But yeah, like in this film, Psycho 3, he feels as hysterical as, Buffalo Bill with the crotch lamps.
Yeah. Honestly, when I watch it, I chalk it up to Anthony Perkins is also directing this thing, maybe a bit in over his head, and his performance kind of suffers from it.
I can believe that. Yeah, that's plausible.
Like he sounds the same in every scene. Like yeah, we've been like that kind of trippy kind of inflection. Like
Yeah.
every scene, he sounds the same, and I don't think that's on the page.
No, yeah, totally. But all I'm saying is that like this film is elevated and exaggerated, and that permeates everything, even this character, even though he kind of is performed in a different way than we've previously seen him.
That's kind of why I love it, but I wish it went further.
Well, if it went further, it would be different. Again, I don't know what it would look like if it went further. I would hope better Because then, like, if you're leaning double or triple leaning into that exaggeration, that over the topness, yeah, it's going to change everything from its tone to, how you receive it. I do think that maybe you would kind of need to recast the nun even. Granted, the actress is like in a well-regarded, critically, like award-winning actress. So I guess one way to frame it is like she is the most grounded character in this narrative, and she starts off as a suicidal nun. So like that kind of tells you maybe all you need to know about the film.
I've actually I've worked with Diana Scarewood
Okay.
back in the day when I did acting.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was in a movie with her and James Woods called Dirty Pictures. It was not a porn.
She seems nice.
Yeah, she's very nice. Very very professional.
Yeah. I just again, right, like tonally, she feels out of place compared to everything else.
That's why I'm saying I wish everything was like further heightened.
Yeah, no, that would have created a different effect. That would be a different film. That might get you to, I know you said Italian Giallo influences. That might get you further into that realm, right? Where things are like so overblown,
Yeah,
so hyper stylized.
it starts off like that. There is no God, death of a fucking nun, meeting Jeff Fahey. The first time we see Norman, he's stuffing birds and eating peanut butter with the same spoon. Like it starts off so bonkers, and I just wish it kept going. Like you have scenes for the first time in this franchise where Norman is having full on conversations with Mother, like where we're seeing him talking to the corpse. Like the black comedy could have been way more in there.
Yeah. Again, like this is part of what I didn't love about it is that Psycho 3 does a lot of things on screen that up to this point you have not seen on screen, but they have been hidden off screen, insinuated. So you've had to kind of piece what little info you've got together and kind of imagine it. And this is like, no, screw that. We're going to have Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates in a wig. He's going to be staring at you, smiling like a moron. He's going to be chasing you around with a knife. Yes, we get that in 1960, but I guess its reservation is more effective than it is full on display of it here, I would argue.
Yeah, yeah. I just feel like we're in the mid 80s at this point, and we have all these iconic slashers having their own franchises. This was a way to make Norman Bates one of them. But yeah, like I love the scenes with him interacting with Mother, but I'm confused by them because Norman, I thought from the original film, he speaks in Mother's voice to himself.
Hmm.
And in this one, when he's interacting with Mother, we hear her voice, but it's in his head. But then when the reporter confronts him in the third act, he literally speaks aloud to her in Mother's voice.
See, your mistake is looking for logic. I know, I don't think that was the highest of priorities here in this picture.
I'm just saying, like, commit to something, pun intended.
I can imagine they did, but it was probably on a scene by scene basis. Does this work for this scene? Is this an effective choice? As opposed to, let's go back and look at the lore, in past films so that we're consistent. I don't think that was a concern of anyone, like, ever.
Oh, I agree. Like this, they clearly didn't give a shit about the lore. Like,
Oh, yeah.
speaking of the reporter in that third act, they go out of their way. She's like spewing this like dialogue to like retcon the whole Mrs. Spool being Norman's mother, and I'm like, who gives a shit, right? Like, who cares?
Because, yeah, like, simply put, part two gives us the plot addition that the Norman Bates mother, Mrs. Bates of 1960, was not really his birth mother. Psycho 2 says he had a different birth mother, and so at the end of Psycho 2, he kills that birth mother and replaces her, so he becomes the new mother at home. And now part 3 says, no, that was a lie. I don't know why the third film would feel the need to do this. Like at this point, does it matter?
No, it doesn't matter. And not only that, it kind of complicates it. So the retcon is that Mrs. Spool was not Norman's mother, but his aunt who killed his real father in a jealous rage. So Mrs. Spool goes from being his real mom to now his real aunt. Again, it's like, who cares? The screenwriter, Charles Edward Pogue,
Yes.
he really disliked the whole Mrs. Spool replacing Norman's mom and wanted to make that retcon.
Well, then he got his wish. Thanks for that.
Do you have any final thoughts on Psycho 3?
It is entirely a product of its time, and personally, I don't prefer the slasher iteration of this Norman Bates story or character personally. So in other words, I'm on board with part 2 and part 3. My enjoyment of it is qualified. It's like I like it, but that's me on part 3.
I love it. But I really like how connected it feels to two. It feels like it's in the same universe. We have the sheriff, we have the diner again, the people that work at the diner. Like it feels really in the same world. Yeah, it feels sweaty at times. Like,
At times, the whole thing 3 is just baked in sweat.
yeah, like Jeff Fahey's like
When it
room that must be a sauna as well.
I mean, some movies like spend a lot of money on fake blood. I can imagine Psycho 3's budget on fake sweat was like through the roof.
The tagline to Psycho 3: Norman Bates is back to normal, but mother's off her rocker again.
See, that's tongue in cheek and playful, which is very much what Psycho 3 is. It is like playful.
Yeah. So, after production wrapped, Perkins and the screenwriter Charles Edward Pogue were asked to pitch an idea for a fourth Psycho. So they pitched this idea of Norman's house and motel becoming a tourist attraction for like horror weekends where people would visit the motel and the house.
So like the Universal Studios theme park.
Exactly. Yeah. And Norman would have escaped the mental institution with a mute patient, and the actor who was set to play Norman Bates for Horror Weekend quits, and Norman gets hired to play Norman. It was meant to be a black comedy. I think it would have been amazing. But what happened was Psycho 3 opened and bombed. So Universal's like, no.
Yeah,
It is the lowest grossing film in the Psycho series.
of the 3 of them.
4.
But did the TV film we're going to talk about next have a gross?
I don't know.
Oh, well, who cares? Let's keep moving.
There was still a Psycho 4, ended up being written by the original writer of Psycho, Joseph Stefano. Yeah, so I guess we should get into Psycho 4, the beginning.
Okay, so like I'm watching Psycho 4, and yeah, like I know it's a whatever Showtime movie, it's a made-for-TV movie. I'm expecting it to be cheap. The sets are a room for the radio show where we see producer John Landis, and the other set is some suburban house where Norman Bates, for some reason, is married, for some reason, is living there, and so like it feels very small in scope, and it feels it. Like that's the problem, right? Like I expect it, but I don't want it to feel cheap. I can just cut to the chase. I really did not like Psycho 4.
Ooh, we have to do the IMDb.
God damn it. Okay.
Um,
So, okay. So, scratch all that.
I thought you were prefacing.
No, no, I wasn't. I was launching into it. Okay, so, you do you.
You really just want to get Psycho 4 out of the way.
Yeah, I do.
If you do happen to go on IMDb, Dion, Psycho 4,
I'm not gonna go onto IMDb to look up Psycho 4.
it will say Norman Bates recalls his childhood with his abusive mother while fearing his unborn child will inherit his split personality disorder.
Um, that's great, except it kind of spoils the big twist at the end of the film. The twist being he is, in fact, going to be a father. That is like the Act 3. Who is he going to murder? Like that's the one of the threads that's carried through.
Yeah, that's like the only thing to spoil in this movie, and it does it. But yeah, this was a made for Showtime TV movie
hmm
because Psycho 3 did so poorly. I think it's just a sequel to the original. I think it disregards 2 and 3.
I think everyone hated 2. The person who wrote 3 didn't like 2, and Joseph Stefano didn't like 2. So, in other words, the writer of 3 and the writer of 4 tried to undo 2 and go back to 1960. Yeah.
Right. So this is like the Halloween 2018 of Psycho movies.
Yes. It's closer to the Rob Zombie Halloween of Psycho movies.
So yeah, written by Joseph Stefano and directed by Mick Garris,
Yes.
who had a podcast, still is a podcast, Postmortem. It's like a horror podcast. He seems like a really nice guy.
He
Like,
seems like a fan, like a true fan.
yeah, yeah. Like he seems like a cool guy to like hang out and talk about movies with. Not the best director. I find his work kind of blah.
Well, I mean, if you need a direct-to-video sequel of of some horror film, he's, probably on a short list.
Well, he was like, I think he kind of got a name for himself doing all these TV movie Stephen King adaptations.
Yeah.
Yeah, he made Sleepwalkers.
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, that might be his best movie. Still a problem. But yeah, he does like to give these directors cameos in his movies. So you mentioned John Landis is in this.
I did.
Yeah, so John Landis is, I don't know. I'm not a fan of Psycho 4. It feels like, I know it's a made for TV movie. It feels like an episode of a TV show. You know, like every TV show's got that one episode in its run where it's basically just like a clip show where it just shows like scenes from past episodes. This feels like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the good because I know I don't really hold this film in too high a regard. The good is that it's interesting that they finally get the Bernard Herrmann Psycho score for a Psycho sequel. Bernard Herrmann's score does not appear in Psycho 2, does not appear in Psycho 3. Oh my god, it's in Psycho 4. That's nostalgically shocking.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that they didn't use any of the iconic music in 2 or 3.
Yeah. It's also interesting that Joseph Stefano does come back, the original screenwriter of the 1960 film. And what's interesting to me isn't the film, but what's interesting to me is that when we talked about Robin Wood on the film Psycho, I've read out a quote where Robin was talking about some of the themes in Psycho about like free will, predestination, a predetermined fate. And what I thought was kind of cool is that Joseph Stefano returns to this film world, the characters of Norman Bates, and he actually returns to those same themes that he wrote about in 1960. So, like, in many ways, thematically, it has more in common with Psycho than you could argue than maybe 2 or 3. At the very least, like, it's tapping into directly what 1960s film did. It's like, okay, that is cool. I like the actors. I like Olivia Hussey. I like Henry Thomas. I don't think I like them in this film, but I appreciate, like, they are talented. I like them. They have screen chemistry. Like, they do something on the screen. I like them. I just think this concept of you called it a clip show. I think it's like, tell me a story that one, I've already heard, and two, I don't need to see. That's why I kind of said like it's the Rob Zombie Halloween of psycho films. Because it's like, let's take you back and imagine a time when young Norman Bates, was impressionable and all this stuff. We got enough of that narrative. We don't need it, right? Like, we don't need to hear it again. We don't need to see it again.
I disagree. I think we did need to see Norman's interaction with Chet. Much like the zombie Halloween movie, we also got an asshole boyfriend in this movie.
Are you talking about the boxing scene in particular?
Sure. I don't know. I found all the stuff with Norman and his mom. It loses the mystique of that whole thing.
Yes, yes. Conceptually, I think it's problematic. Any of the execution stuff to me is secondary. It's like the very idea of this, I think, is wrong. Like, it just like, or not wrong, but like it is ineffectual. It is not compelling. It is whatever the opposite of like a good idea is.
Well, it also confuses me because casting Olivia Hussey, she strikes me as really young to be Norman's mom. And then I'm like, oh, was it the idea the whole time that when Norman killed his mom, she was younger, but she just kept aging in his mind? Because the mother he speaks to when she's like a corpse, she's like an old woman. She sounds like an old, like haggard woman.
The psycho Biddy, yeah.
Yeah, but is that what we're supposed to think? Like that she just keeps aging in Norman's mind? Because she doesn't sound like Olivia Hussey at all.
Um, I don't know. Like,
Well, this is why it confuses me.
okay, so like what I would say is I don't think the film is that interested in that complexity.
Well, it should be if that's like half your movie. Like,
Don't talk to me, right? I didn't write the thing. But it isn't interested. It's like, we know Psycho culturally. We know Psycho is Anthony Perkins talking to his old mother, who he claims was an invalid or whatever. So the expectation is that she was old. And you're right, Olivia Hussey's performance. She is not. I mean, she's old, but not a senior citizen. So I don't know. I don't know why they did it beyond that was a detail that wasn't as important as seeing the living, breathing character on screen. And we can get that with a great actress like Olivia Hussey.
Yeah, they also confuse the death of Norman's father. In this, we see they're at the funeral of his father and he was stung by bees.
It's killed by bees.
Yeah, and I'm like, I'm not even sure if we ever got what happened to Norman's father in the original film.
Uh,
I know in Psycho 3, Mrs. Spool murdered him, but that whole thing has nothing to do with Psycho 4.
in the 1960 film, Norman Bates explains that his mother bought the motel because of the boyfriend. And so, in other words, the father died, we don't know how, before they were living at the motel in the house. She got involved as a widow with a new man, and that new man presumably was using her in part for her money and encouraged her to buy the motel. That's what we're told in 1960, yeah.
So yeah, that's right. Uh, then that still confuses me because Chet, when he comes into the picture, they already have the motel.
Oh, that's correct. So, like, Joseph Stefano forgot to read his 1960 script.
Oh, okay.
He's the same guy. He wrote it. He wrote it in 1960, and then he writes this thing in 1990 is when this one
Yeah.
comes out? Yeah. So, like, that detail is a very minor plot point in 1960. That said, what it does do is it does provide Norman Bates with added motivation to kill the boyfriend. The boyfriend is using all the money is by encouraging her to waste it on this motel in the middle of nowhere. That's kinda gone if they're already there, because all it is then is he's an asshole boyfriend.
Yeah, which is why they named him Chet. But also the psychiatrist played by Warren Frost from Twin Peaks. Okay, he's credited as Dr. Leo Richmond,
Yes?
and the psychiatrist at the end of the original Psycho who explains everything, he's credited as Dr. Well, on IMDb it's Fred Richmond, and Warren Frost is also Dr. Richmond, but they make it seem like he's supposed to be the psychiatrist from the original film.
Yeah, they do. So the way in Psycho 4 the character is introduced is one of his first cases was with Norman Bates. So yeah, they don't directly say it's the same doctor from Psycho, but they do say that he met Norman shortly after the murder.
It's just weird he has a different first name.
Yeah, I think this is a detail that is definitely not fleshed out. There's not enough in the script to infer it's the same person, just that he had a relationship with Norman Bates.
Right, but his name's Dr. Richmond.
Well, they could be brothers. What do I know?
That's what I mean, like, this movie confuses me because the information we're told from the original film, there's a lot of contradictory things going on in this film, which you think would not be the case because 'cause they're written by the same guy.
Yeah. So obviously, no one involved in the film thought it would be important enough to bring up or clarify. There's no other reason why you'd have all these discrepancies and kind of not even plot holes, but like loose ends.
Right.
But it is weird though, right? To your point that because again, it wouldn't have harmed anyone to make it the same character as the psychiatrist at the end of the 1960 film, even if it was played by a different actor, unless we're meant to believe the psychiatrist changed their first name for some reason, which is a stretch.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's kinda confusing and it's kinda dull.
I would agree. I found it not compelling. Like, it didn't tell me anything I didn't already know.
I mean, this movie is basically aside from, like, the, last 10 minutes, it's a bunch of phone calls, really. Like, Norman's calling into a radio station, and he's in a kitchen.
Telling me a story like Broken Telephone.
Yeah.
How much do we believe Norman Bates' story of this? In other words, like, yes, Norman Bates killed his mother, stuffed her, kept her, and used that voice to kind of give him control, but also enact this, brutal violence. But we don't necessarily know that his mother treated him poorly.
And I was always under the impression that he didn't start dressing up as his mother till after he killed her.
Yeah, so again, the beautiful end of 1960 gives us the rationale from the psychiatrist, which is very much that the whole idea of dressing in the mother's clothes is to maintain the illusion of the mother's control and power. That isn't needed to happen until after she's gone.
Right.
This character of the mother also feels very harsh in a sense that we're meant to like almost sympathize with Norman Bates. But what if his mother was not a monster? And what if it was all in his head?
Ooh.
This film tells us no, his mother was a monster and that's why she got killed and that's why he became a bad guy. But like the only reason that we know any of this is if we trust what Norman Bates tells us. Why should we? or if we trust what the psychiatrist tells us. They're useless. Why should we? To me, this also feels like kind of a reductive cheat. It's like, no, I don't want the mother to be a monster.
Yeah, that would have been interesting because, like,
If the mother was good,
yeah,
and then he turns on her, he thinks he sees things, he hears things, like, that would have been,
and that would have shown us something that we didn't see coming.
yes, see that, hey, that's interesting.
Look at you making the movie better.
This is not interesting. No.
No. Also, why would Norman Bates call into a radio show and divulge all this information about his life?
Calling himself Ed, which felt like a little on the nose, Ed Gein. I think Joseph Stefano probably thought he was clever. I don't know. 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 I mean, for as much care and nuance and detail and love as the 1960 film had, and the 1983 film had, Psycho 2, this film doesn't have any of that.
You missed Psycho 3.
Oh, I totally did. I totally did.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that would have been really interesting if Norma Bates, his mom, was really nice and really good to him.
Just baking pies and saying like, Norman, you shouldn't fantasize about, like, but not being like beating him with, with soap bars and an empty sock, right? Like, not like abusing him, just like being a mother,
Yeah.
right? Like, like a good mother, but like a caring mother. That would have been like, wow, yeah, I had it all wrong. I didn't know the true story.
Yeah.
This story is the story that Norman Bates has been telling for decades. I don't trust Norman Bates. He's a psychopath. Why should I, right?
And whoever played Chet, he is no Dennis Franz or Jeff Fahey.
No, not sweaty enough by half.
Any final thoughts at Psycho 4, the beginning?
I don't know why the film has created these loose threads beyond the fact that it has intentionally done so. Some of these things don't make sense, like why the psychiatrist has a different first name, or whether or not the events of Psycho 2 or 3 are actually canon in the plot of Psycho 4. How Norman Bates is released. None of these are questions that the film Psycho 4 is really interested in, which is why I said earlier, I think the film is interested in these same themes that Stefano was writing about in the 1960 film. That's all fine and good, except some of the other things you're pointing out are like gaping, not even plot holes, but just like inconsistencies, loose threads. Sloppy. It just feels sloppy. I really didn't enjoy it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm trying to be polite. I'm trying to be polite.
uh, I loved it. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Uh, yeah. There was a reason why we were just going to do part 2 and 3.
Yeah, no, it seriously, if I had seen part 4 when you had asked me, should we add it? I would have given you a different answer. It is interesting though, like as a contrast, right? Like that is the one true value of seeing Psycho 4 is to to some degrees it's really like to see how far it's fallen. but like to really see these different takes at it and how what Psycho 2 adds, even what Psycho 3 adds. You could argue the relative merits of those things. I don't think you can argue the relative merits of what Psycho 4 adds. Like that's the reason to see them all together. Yeah.
The tagline of Psycho 4, the beginning: "Before the terror can end, see how it all began."
Yeah. Okay, fine.
I think by terror, they're referring to the phone call.
Before the phone call can end, see how it all began. We have talked about that it's a prequel, right?
Well, it's a prequel and a sequel.
That's true, yeah. In terms of a prequel, this is just like standard prequel terrain. So see how it all began because you might have missed that exposition in 1960.
And this movie ends with the baby crying.
Yes.
So Norman Bates has a child.
Yes.
I'm a little shocked we didn't get another TV movie like Son of Psycho.
With Osgood Perkins.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, because Perkins has worked as an actor, I am kind of surprised there wasn't a TV. And granted, there were TV series and whatnot, but I'm kind of surprised. Yeah, there wasn't another made-for-TV film.
Yeah, I'm just surprised they didn't keep going. Like, even though Anthony Perkins dies 2 years after this,
Yeah.
I'm just surprised they didn't keep going with that cliffhanger of the baby. So it's a little surprising. So this was a made-for-TV film, so I didn't have any information on box office, but it received high Nielsen ratings with around 10 million viewers when it premiered.
That's not nothing,
Anthony Perkins said this was the best sequel.
which is interesting given he directed one of them. That was our thoughts, all of them, well, a lot of them, on Psycho 2, Psycho 3, and Psycho 4 at the beginning. If you have any thoughts about any of these three films or the Psycho universe, please reach out to us either at our email address at cultfilmschoolpodcast@gmail.com or connect with us on one of our social media platforms.
Okay, so Norman Bates, Psycho 2, 3, 4, The Beginning. Unlike other like horror movie series, what I kind of appreciate about them is they're all different films.
Yes, no two films of these sequels are the same, even the same attempt at genre. No, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of like that about them. And Norman's different in all of them. I was gonna say there's growth in the character, but like, I mean, I know like part four is like does it disregards two and three, but you can read it like it includes two and three. Like in two, Norman's back, in three, he gets a girlfriend, and by four, he's ready for marriage and a kid, and like he's I don't know.
I always thought it was weird watching it how, like, in Psycho 2, Norman Bates has got gray hair, and then I think by 3, he's dyed it brown or whatever. Between 2 and 3, he's found just for men. Like, for me, it seems like a weird choice, right? Like, part of the allure of this is that they have this character who was, like, say, a young adult in his maybe late 20s. And then, 20 years later, he is, a different phase of his life. So you reflect that. And I kind of like that about Psycho 2. And it feels disingenuous how he kind of looks younger in 3 and 4.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in three, he's got that like crew cut thing going on too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
This is a series of diminishing returns, though, seriously, right? You can say what you want about Psycho 3, and I wouldn't it's not like I'm not echoing some of the things that you like about it, but it is not the film Psycho 2 is, which again, as we've said, is kind of surprising in its own right. To some degree, this is also the story of what happens when a studio, Universal, doesn't know when to say when. It's like, let's, hey, all of these other low budget horror movies are making sequels galore in the 80s. We can do that. We have a beloved character, a beloved, film, a property, franchise, whatever you want to call it. So let's do more of that. As much as I totally agree that like different filmmakers are taking different attempts, different generic approaches to the same story. I don't know. 2 was enough. 3 was enough. 4 is too many. Right? Like
four is too many. Yeah. Like Psycho 2 is legit great. Psycho 3, I love. I have fun with it. But yeah, it is not the film 2 is. Yeah. 4 is kind of shit. So Dion,
yes.
like Marion and Norman discussed, we're all in our personal traps. What's yours?
I'm here with you. What do you want? So after we've had our fill of Hitchcock exploitation, we're going to take a bit of a palate cleanser with our next episode. In our next episode at Cult Film School, we're going to be talking about musical aliens. Yes, that's right. We're going to be looking at and discussing Voyage of the Rock Aliens and Earth Girls Are Easy next time at Cult Film School.
Are we going to sing?
And dance.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Cult Film School. Leave a rating and review for the show and subscribe to the podcast to be the first to know when the next episode drops.
Follow us on Letterboxd and our social media, all at Cult Film School, and reach out with opinions on the films we covered in today's show and ideas for cult films we might cover in future episodes at cultfilmschoolpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time. Class dismissed.